Thousands of years before Noah built his ark, the gods decided to wipe out humanity with a great flood. One god refused to stay silent. His name was Enki. While the other gods took an oath to let us die, Enki spoke, not to a man, but to a wall. He whispered the secret of survival into the reeds, knowing a pious human was listening on the other side. This wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of genius. He is the god of wisdom, the master of the waters, and the reason humanity exists today. Who was this ancient trickster who defied the divine council to save us? Here is the truth about Enki. The Sumerian god's name means Lord of the Earth. Enki is also known as Ea in Babylonian and Akkadian mythology. Together with Anu and Enlil, he is one of the three key gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Though his vast appetite for sexual conquest may bring his mores into question, he was very compassionate in nature. His desire to nurture humans and favor their side over the gods, as well as a tendency towards solving rather than starting conflicts, balanced out his lustful deviance. Of all the gods who have populated the vast and extraordinary landscape of human religious imagination, few are as multifaceted, as intellectually compelling, or as deeply intertwined with the foundations of civilization itself as Enki. He is a deity who defies simple categorization. He is at once the divine craftsman and the celestial trickster, the loving father of humanity and the incorrigible seducer, the keeper of the sacred laws that govern reality, and the mischievous spirit who bends those same laws to his own purposes. In Enki, we encounter a god of remarkable depth, whose contradictions and complexities mirror the contradictions and complexities of human nature itself. Enki's domain was vast and encompassed some of the most fundamental forces in the ancient Mesopotamian worldview. He presided over the fresh waters, the life-giving rivers, and the subterranean aquifer known as the Abzu, which was believed to lie beneath the earth and give rise to all springs, wells, and flowing water. In a civilization that arose between two great rivers and depended utterly upon the management of water for its survival, no domain could have been more central to the concerns of everyday life. Water was not merely a physical substance in Mesopotamian thought. It was the medium through which divine power flowed into the world, the substance from which life itself was born, and the element most closely associated with wisdom, magic, and the mysteries of creation. Beyond his mastery of water, Enki was the god of wisdom and intelligence, of craftsmanship and technical skill, of magic and incantation, and of the fundamental ordering principles that structured both the cosmos and human society. He was said to be the possessor of the Mi, a Sumerian term that can be loosely translated as the divine laws or the fundamental principles of civilization, encompassing everything from kingship and priesthood to music and the descent into the underworld. That such a comprehensive portfolio of powers and responsibilities should be assigned to a single deity speaks to the central place that Enki occupied in the Mesopotamian religious imagination. What makes Enki particularly fascinating to modern observers is the way in which his mythology engages with questions that remain eternally relevant. His stories ask, what is the proper relationship between the gods and humanity? Who bears responsibility for the suffering of innocent people? Is it ever right to defy authority in the name of compassion? How should wisdom be wielded, and for whose benefit? These are not merely ancient questions posed in the language of myth. They are questions that every generation must answer anew, and the answers that Enki's mythology proposes are among the most humane and thoughtful to be found anywhere in the ancient world. It is perhaps for this reason that Enki has attracted increasing scholarly attention in recent decades, as researchers have worked to piece together a more complete picture of ancient Mesopotamian religion and culture. Enki has emerged as one of its most significant and intriguing figures. The texts that survive from the ancient cities of Sumer and Akkad, though fragmentary and sometimes maddeningly incomplete, paint a portrait of a god whose personality and values were carefully and lovingly constructed over many centuries of theological reflection. Enki is not a god who emerged fully formed from a single moment of divine inspiration. He is the product of millennia of human thought. a composite figure whose various attributes and stories accumulated gradually as different communities and different traditions contributed their own understanding of what this great god represented. This expanded study of Enki seeks to do justice to the full complexity of one of the ancient world's most remarkable divine figures. It traces his origins in the earliest layers of Sumerian religion, examines the rich corpus of myths and stories that were told about him, explores the theological and philosophical significance of his various attributes and domains, and considers his lasting influence on subsequent religious traditions and cultural developments. In doing so, it aims not merely to provide an encyclopedic account of what the ancient texts say about Enki, but to bring this extraordinary figure to life for a modern audience, to help readers understand why this god mattered so deeply to the people who worshipped him, and why he continues to matter to anyone who seeks to understand the deep roots of human civilization. Throughout this study, we will encounter Enki in many different guises. We will see him as the cosmic engineer who shaped the world at the dawn of creation, directing the rivers, filling the seas, and establishing the conditions necessary for life to flourish. We will see him as the divine teacher who instructed humanity in the arts of agriculture, animal husbandry, and all the crafts and skills that make civilized life possible. We will see him as the compassionate protector who again and again stood between human beings and the destructive wrath of other gods, using his wisdom and his cunning to preserve the human race from catastrophe. We will see him as the cunning trickster who outwitted his rivals through cleverness rather than force, achieving through guile what brute strength could never have accomplished. And we will see him as the deeply flawed being who, despite his wisdom and his compassion, was subject to the same appetites and weaknesses that afflict all beings, divine and human alike. In all these guises, Enki remains one of the most compelling figures in the entire history of religion. His mythology is a treasure house of insight into the ancient Mesopotamian mind, a window into a world that was in many ways profoundly different from our own, yet in other ways strikingly similar. To understand Enki is to understand something important, not just about the ancient past, but about the enduring human search for wisdom, compassion, and meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to human needs and aspirations. He stands, even across the vast distance of millennia, as a figure of remarkable relevance and power. The civilization that created Enki was itself one of the most extraordinary achievements in all of human history. Arising in the fertile river valleys of what is now southern Iraq, approximately 5,000 years ago, Sumerian civilization produced the world's first writing system, the world's first codified laws, the world's first cities, and the world's first large-scale agricultural economy. It also produced one of the world's first and most sophisticated theological traditions, a complex and carefully organized understanding of the divine world that addressed the fundamental questions of human existence with a directness and an intellectual rigor that commands respect even across the vast gulf of time and culture that separates us from the ancient Sumerians. Enki was at the center of this theological tradition, its most multifaceted and most intellectually interesting divine figure. And to understand him is to understand something important about the civilization that created him. The Mesopotamian world in which Enki was worshipped was one of extraordinary cultural richness and complexity. The great cities of Sumer, including Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, and many others, were centers of cultural and intellectual life unparalleled in the ancient world. Their temples were not merely places of worship, but centers of learning, libraries of cuneiform tablets, workshops of craftsmanship, and hubs of economic activity. The scribes who staffed these institutions were among the most educated people in the ancient world, trained in the arts of reading, writing, mathematics, astronomy, divination, and music. The gods they served, and particularly Enki, the patron of all these arts and skills, were understood not as primitive supernatural beings demanding blind obedience, but as cosmic principles of wisdom, creativity, and order, whose worship was an act of intellectual and spiritual engagement. It is in this context that the full significance of Enki becomes apparent. He was not merely the patron of a useful natural resource or a specialized divine function. He was the divine embodiment of the highest values of Mesopotamian civilization, the god who represented what that civilization most fundamentally admired and aspired to: wisdom, creativity, compassion, and the ability to use intelligence and knowledge in the service of human welfare. To worship Enki was to affirm these values, to commit oneself to the pursuit of wisdom and the practice of compassion, to acknowledge that the highest form of divine and human power is the power that serves and sustains life, rather than the power that destroys it. Origin: Enki was originally the patron god of the city of Eridu. Eridu was believed to be the first city ever created, according to ancient Sumerian beliefs. Though he is first noted as an Akkadian god from around 2350 BC, shrines to Enki have been found, which date back to 5400 BC. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth found on ancient tablets and dating to approximately 1100 BC, the universe was originally in a state of chaos. The chaos separated into fresh water, the male principle called Abzu, and salt water, the female principle called Tiamat. Abzu and Tiamat were the first gods and gave birth to Enki, their eldest child. The origins of Enki stretch back to the very earliest periods of recorded human history, and indeed beyond, into a prehistory of religious thought and practice that we can only partially reconstruct. The city of Eridu, with which Enki is most intimately associated, occupies a position of extraordinary importance in both the archaeological record and in the mythological traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. According to the Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world, kingship was first lowered from heaven to the city of Eridu at the very beginning of human civilization before the great flood that reshaped the world. This document, which mingles historical data with mythological narrative in a characteristically Mesopotamian fashion, assigns to the kings of Eridu reigns of almost incomprehensible length, with individual rulers said to have reigned for thousands upon thousands of years. Archaeological excavations at the site of ancient Eridu, located in what is now southern Iraq near the modern city of Nasiriyah, have confirmed that this was indeed one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in all of Mesopotamia. The earliest occupation layers at Eridu date to approximately 5400 BC, which corresponds precisely to the oldest evidence for shrines dedicated to Enki that the archaeological record has preserved. What the archaeologists found at Eridu is remarkable. A sequence of temples built one upon another, each successive structure incorporating the ruins of its predecessor, creating a stratified architectural record of religious continuity stretching across more than 3,000 years. The site of these temples in Eridu was not chosen arbitrarily. It lay at what the ancient Sumerians believed was the original meeting point between the fresh waters of the Abzu and the surface of the earth. In Sumerian cosmological thought, the Abzu, the great underground ocean of fresh water, was not merely a physical feature of the landscape, but a cosmic principle, the source from which all fresh water ultimately derived, and the medium through which divine wisdom and creative power flowed into the world. The transition from the earliest Sumerian conception of Enki to the fully developed deity who appears in the great literary texts of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC was not a simple or straightforward process. It involved the gradual accumulation of attributes, stories, and theological associations from many different sources and traditions. The earliest evidence suggests that Enki was primarily a local deity, the patron god of Eridu, and the divine embodiment of the fresh waters upon which that city's survival depended. Over time, as Eridu's cultural and religious influence spread throughout the region, Enki's cult expanded as well, and he came to be associated with a much broader range of domains and powers. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, provides one of the most elaborate accounts of Enki's cosmic origins, though it is important to note that this text, while it draws on much older Sumerian traditions, represents a relatively late synthesis that was composed during the early part of the 2nd millennium BC and achieved its canonical form during the 1st millennium. The Enuma Elish opens with a state of primordial chaos, a state before any differentiation had occurred, before any distinct things had come into being, before even the gods existed. In this primordial state, the text describes only the mingling of two types of water, Abzu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. From this primordial mingling emerged the first gods. In the Babylonian tradition, as recorded in the Enuma Elish, Enki, here called Ea, his Akkadian name, is identified as the son of Abzu and Tiamat, born from their union as the waters began to differentiate and the first principles of cosmic order began to emerge from the primal chaos. The narrative that follows is one of the great family dramas of world mythology, involving parricide, generational conflict, and the ultimate establishment of cosmic order through divine warfare. This story of Enki's earliest mythological act is deeply revealing. Rather than meeting force with force, rather than confronting his father directly in open combat, Enki defeats him through cunning and the power of magical incantation. This preference for wisdom, cleverness, and magic over brute force is one of the most consistent and characteristic features of Enki's mythology across all periods and all literary traditions. In a pantheon populated by warrior gods and storm gods whose power was expressed through violence and overwhelming might, Enki stands apart as a deity who achieves his ends through intelligence. The relationship between the Sumerian figure of Enki and his Akkadian counterpart Ea is a complex one that has occupied scholars for many generations. In the process of cultural synthesis that occurred when the Akkadian-speaking Semitic populations of northern Mesopotamia gradually came to dominate the region during the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, the Sumerian religious tradition was largely absorbed into and preserved by the Akkadian tradition, with Sumerian deities being identified with their Akkadian equivalents. Enki and Ea are so thoroughly identified in the surviving literature that it is sometimes difficult to determine whether a given text reflects Sumerian or Akkadian traditions. The cosmological significance of Enki's origins cannot be overstated. In the Mesopotamian worldview, the creation of the world was not a single, instantaneous event, but a gradual process of differentiation and ordering in which the primordial chaos was progressively organized into the structured cosmos that human beings inhabited. Enki played a central role in this process, not merely as a passive participant, but as an active agent of cosmic ordering. His establishment of the Abzu as his own domain was not merely an act of personal appropriation, it was a cosmologically significant act that helped to establish the fundamental structure of the universe, creating a clear boundary between the underground realm of fresh water and the surface world of human habitation. The divine council in which Enki participated as one of its 3 supreme members was not merely a theological construction, but a reflection of the political reality of Mesopotamian city-state culture, just as human affairs were governed by councils of elders and city assemblies. So divine affairs were imagined as governed by a council of the great gods, in which decisions were reached through deliberation and debate. Enki's role in this council was distinctive. He was not the most powerful member, nor the most authoritative, but he was consistently the most intelligent and the most creative, the one whose wisdom guided the council's decisions and whose ingenuity found solutions to problems that brute authority could not address. The figure of Enki as it emerges from the earliest layers of the tradition is already remarkably complete in its essential character. The god of wisdom, the lord of fresh water, the patron of craftsmanship and magic, the compassionate friend of humanity, All of these essential attributes are present even in the earliest surviving texts and images. This completeness suggests that the theological reflection that produced the figure of Enki had been proceeding for a very long time before the earliest written records preserve its results, that the image of the Lord of the Abzu had been taking shape in the minds and the hearts of the people of southern Mesopotamia for generations or centuries before it was finally committed to writing on clay tablets and to stone in temple sculptures. Sacred City of Eridu. The city of Eridu occupies a position in Sumerian religious and cultural consciousness that has no precise parallel in any other ancient civilization. It was not merely the oldest city, but the first city, the place where civilization itself had begun, the point at which the divine order had first descended into the human world and transformed it. This foundational status gave Eridu a sacred character that persisted throughout the entire history of Mesopotamian civilization, even as the political center of power shifted from city to city and as the religious landscape underwent profound transformations over the millennia. The physical location of Eridu is itself significant. Situated at the southern tip of ancient Mesopotamia, in the region where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers approach the Persian Gulf, Eridu lay at the edge of the world as the ancient Sumerians conceived it. It was a boundary place, a liminal location where the inhabited world met the wilderness of the marshes and the open waters of the sea. In Sumerian cosmological thought, such boundary places were inherently sacred, charged with a numinous power that derived from their proximity to the fundamental principles of cosmic order. The archaeological record at Eridu tells a story of extraordinary religious continuity. The sequence of temples dedicated to Enki at this site spans more than 3,000 years, beginning with the earliest mud brick shrines of the Ubaid period in the 5th millennium BC and continuing through the great temples of the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and later periods. This continuity is remarkable in itself, but what makes it even more striking is the consistency of the architectural tradition. Each successive temple was built on the ruins of its predecessor, preserving the sacred space and the sacred orientation that had been established at the very beginning. The myths and legends that accumulated around Eridu over the centuries created a rich and complex literary tradition. In the Sumerian text, known as the Eridu Genesis, a mythological narrative that has been preserved in fragmentary form and that dates to approximately the 17th century BC, Eridu figures prominently as the primordial city, the first place where the gods established kingship on earth. This text, like many Sumerian mythological narratives, interweaves cosmological and historical themes in a way that is characteristic of Mesopotamian literary culture, treating the origins of civilization not as a matter of mere human ingenuity, but as a divine gift bestowed upon a specific place at a specific moment in cosmic history. The association between Eridu and the Garden of Eden, noted in the original text, is one that has attracted considerable scholarly attention. The Hebrew term Eden is generally understood to derive from a Semitic root meaning delight or pleasure, but some scholars have proposed that it may also be connected to the Sumerian word Eden, which referred to the flat, fertile plain of southern Mesopotamia. More compelling is the thematic parallel between the garden planted in Eden in Genesis and the sacred garden that surrounded the temple of Enki at Eridu, which was believed to be a place of extraordinary beauty and abundance. The city of Eridu also plays a central role in the Mesopotamian flood traditions, which have obvious connections to the biblical account of Noah. In the Sumerian version of the flood story, preserved in the text known as the Eridu Genesis, the city of Eridu is the place from which the hero of the flood, a figure known as Ziusudra, comes. Ziusudra is described as a pious king who maintained a faithful relationship with the gods and who was consequently warned of the impending catastrophe and given the instructions necessary to survive it. The religious and cultural significance of Eridu extended far beyond the boundaries of the city itself. Throughout Mesopotamian history, Eridu was regarded as the paradigmatic holy city, the model against which all other sacred centers were measured. When later, Mesopotamian kings wished to emphasize the legitimacy and the cosmic significance of their own cities and temples, they frequently invoked the name and the traditions of Eridu. The Assyrian city of Nineveh was sometimes described in terms that echoed the descriptions of Eridu, and the great ziggurat complexes of Babylon and other later cities were understood as earthly reflections of the cosmic mountain that Enki's temple in Eridu was believed to embody. The decline of Eridu as a living city, which appears to have occurred sometime in the 2nd millennium BC as environmental changes altered the distribution of water in southern Mesopotamia, and as political power shifted northward, did not diminish the city's religious importance in the Mesopotamian imagination. Even after Eridu had been largely abandoned as a place of habitation, it continued to be maintained as a sacred site, and to be visited by pilgrims and by kings who wished to perform rituals at what was believed to be the oldest and most sacred place in the world. The legacy of Eridu in contemporary archaeological and historical scholarship is also significant. The site has been excavated by several different expeditions over the past century and a half, beginning with the British archaeologist J.E. Taylor in the 1850s and continuing through the Iraqi excavations of the 20th century. These excavations have confirmed the extraordinary antiquity of the site and have revealed the remarkable depth of its temple sequence, providing physical evidence for the continuity of religious practice that the written sources describe. The name Eridu itself carries resonances that extend far beyond its immediate geographical context. In the Mesopotamian theological imagination, Eridu was not merely one city among many, but the origin point of civilization itself. The place where the divine order first touched the earth and began the long process of transforming the raw material of the natural world into the organized, cultured, spiritually meaningful human world. This understanding of Eridu as the birthplace of civilization gave it a symbolic importance that transcended its physical size or its political significance at any given moment in history. The Temple of Enki at Eridu, with its sequence of overlapping structures representing more than 3 millennia of continuous religious activity, is one of the most remarkable architectural monuments in the history of human civilization. More than any single building or sculpture or text, this layered temple complex embodies the continuity and the depth of the religious tradition associated with Enki, the accumulation of generation upon generation of devotion and theological reflection in a single sacred space. To stand at the site of ancient Eridu today, looking out over the flat landscape of southern Iraq toward the distant horizon, is to stand at the origin point of one of humanity's oldest and most profound religious traditions, a tradition whose influence continues to be felt in the religious life of the contemporary world. Enki in the Pantheon. To understand Enki's place in the Mesopotamian religious universe, it is necessary to understand something of the broader structure of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The gods of Mesopotamia were not a random collection of supernatural beings, but a structured and hierarchically organized divine society, reflecting in its organization the structures of the human political world that the Mesopotamians knew. At the head of this divine society stood a council of the great gods, and it was within this council that the most important decisions about the fate of the cosmos and of humanity were made. The supreme authority in the Mesopotamian pantheon was formally vested in the god Anu, whose name simply means sky in Sumerian. Anu was the father of the gods, the distant and somewhat passive ruler of the heavens, whose authority was recognized by all, but who rarely intervened directly in the affairs of either gods or humans. His primary role was to serve as the ultimate source of divine legitimacy, the ground of cosmic order, the being from whom all other gods derive their authority. In the elaborate ceremonial language of Mesopotamian royal inscriptions and religious texts, the authority of kings and the power of priests was regularly traced back to the approval and sponsorship of Anu. Beside Anu, in the uppermost tier of the pantheon, stood the two other great gods of the triad, Enlil, the lord of the air and the wind, and Enki, the lord of the fresh waters. These three gods between them presided over the three great realms of the Mesopotamian cosmos: the heavens, the earth's surface and the atmosphere, and the underground waters and the subterranean realm. This tripartite division of the cosmos reflects a characteristic feature of Mesopotamian cosmological thinking, which tended to organize reality into structured hierarchies. The relationship between Enlil and Enki is one of the most significant and productive tensions in the entire corpus of Mesopotamian mythology. Enlil, the Lord of the Wind, was in many respects Enki's opposite. Where Enki was associated with wisdom, cunning, and compassion, Enlil was associated with power, authority, and an often terrifying readiness to use force. Enlil was the god who decreed the fates of humans and gods alike, whose word could not be revoked once spoken, whose anger could manifest as storms, floods, and other catastrophic natural events. The god Marduk, who rose to prominence during the Babylonian period and eventually displaced the older deities as the supreme god of the pantheon in the great Babylonian theological synthesis of the 2nd millennium BC, was the son of Enki. This genealogical relationship is theologically significant. Marduk's supremacy is grounded in his inheritance of Enki's wisdom and magical power, and many of the texts that describe Marduk's powers do so in terms that closely parallel the descriptions of Enki's powers in earlier Sumerian literature. The place of Enki within the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy was expressed not only in mythological narrative, but also in the elaborate system of divine names and epithets that Mesopotamian theologians developed over many centuries. In the great canonical list of divine names known as Anu, which represents the most comprehensive attempt by Mesopotamian scribes to organize and systematize the entire divine world, Enki appears with a long sequence of names and epithets that cumulatively describe his vast domains and his many attributes. The number 40 was traditionally associated with Enki in Mesopotamian numerology, a system in which each of the major gods was assigned a specific number that expressed their rank and power within the divine hierarchy. Anu was assigned the number 60, the highest number in the sexagesimal system that the Mesopotamians used for calculation. Enlil was assigned 50 in some traditions. Enki was assigned the number 40, a number that carried strong associations with completeness and perfection in Mesopotamian thought. One of the most distinctive features of Enki's position in the Mesopotamian pantheon was his role as a cosmic mediator, where other gods represented particular domains or aspects of reality and exercised their power within those domains. Enki had a unique capacity to move between domains, to cross the boundaries that separated different realms of existence, and to apply his wisdom and his magical skill to problems that lay beyond the purview of any single domain. This mediating function was closely connected to his nature as a water god. Just as water moves freely between the underground realm of the Abzu, the surface of the earth, and the heavens above, so Enki moved freely between the divine and human worlds. It is this mediating function that explains why Enki was so often called upon in times of crisis and catastrophe. When the great mother goddess Inanna descended to the underworld and was killed by the queen of the dead, it was Enki who devised the plan to bring her back to life. When the hero Gilgamesh sought the plant of immortality at the bottom of the sea, it was Enki who had knowledge of its location. When the human race was threatened with extinction by divine decree, it was Enki who found the way to preserve them. The relationship between Enki and the other major deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon was not always harmonious, but it was always dynamic and productive. His interactions with Inanna generated some of the most dramatic and theologically rich narratives in the entire corpus of Sumerian literature. His relationship with Ninhursag was characterized by a creative tension between desire and wisdom that produced many of the great works of divine craftsmanship. His relationship with his son Marduk was one of delegation and inheritance, as the father progressively transferred his powers and his wisdom to the son who would carry on his legacy. In the cosmic assembly of the gods, Enki's voice was always the voice of wisdom, the one that urged careful thought before decisive action, that sought peaceful resolution where others demanded violent confrontation, and that consistently raised the question of whether the planned course of action was truly just and truly wise. This role as the conscience of the divine council made him both the most respected and sometimes the most frustrating of the great gods. The deity whose counsel was always sought and not always followed, whose wisdom was acknowledged even when it was overridden. The theological tradition that presented Enki as the wisest of the gods was not merely a flattering convention. It reflected a genuine theological conviction about the nature of wisdom and its relationship to divine authority. The Mesopotamians understood that wisdom and power were different qualities that did not always go together, and that the most powerful god was not necessarily the wisest. Enki's position in the pantheon, below Anu, and sometimes presented as subordinate to Enlil in terms of formal authority, but widely acknowledged as the wisest of all the gods, embodied this understanding. True wisdom is not measured by rank or power, but by the depth of one's understanding and the quality of one's judgment. The Abzu. Of all the concepts associated with Enki, perhaps none is more fundamental or more richly suggestive than the Abzu, the great underground ocean of fresh water that the ancient Sumerians believed lay beneath the surface of the earth. The Abzu was not merely the physical dwelling place of Enki, it was the cosmic principle that he embodied, the source of wisdom and creative power from which all divine action in the world ultimately derived. To understand the Abzu is to understand something essential about Enki himself and about the worldview of the civilization that created him. The Sumerian word Abzu, sometimes transcribed as Apsu in its Akkadian form, is generally understood to mean something like abyss of water or underground ocean, though the precise etymology remains a matter of scholarly discussion. What is clear is that the word referred to the great body of fresh water that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the surface of the earth, continuously replenishing the springs, wells, and rivers that sustained life on the surface. This belief was not entirely without empirical basis. In the marshy lowlands of southern Mesopotamia, fresh water does indeed well up from below the ground in springs and pools, and the level of the water table is often very close to the surface. In Mesopotamian cosmological thought, the earth was conceived as a flat disk floating on the surface of the Abzu, surrounded by the salt water of the ocean and covered by the dome of the sky. This tripartite cosmos, with its layers of water above and below and its inhabited surface in between, was the fundamental framework within which all Mesopotamian religious and philosophical thought operated. The Abzu occupied the lowest layer of this cosmos, the realm beneath the earth, but it was also the most generative realm, the source from which all fertility and all creative power ultimately derived. Enki's establishment of his divine dwelling in the Abzu was therefore not merely a matter of finding an appropriate home for a water deity. It was a cosmologically significant act that placed him at the very source of creative power in the universe. By presiding over the Abzu, Enki presided over the ultimate source of life and wisdom, the generative depth from which all things arose. This position gave him a unique perspective on the cosmos, where other gods surveyed the world from above. From the heights of heaven or the surface of the earth, Enki looked up at the world from below, from the deepest foundations of reality. The Abzu was not only the domain of fresh water and wisdom, it was also the realm of magic and incantation. In Mesopotamian thought, the connection between water and magic was deep and multifaceted. Water was understood as a purifying substance, capable of washing away impurity and evil, and the rituals of purification that played such an important role in Mesopotamian religious practice regularly involved the use of water drawn from the sacred pool associated with Enki's temples. The sacred pool that was a characteristic feature of Enki's temples in Eridu and elsewhere was understood as a terrestrial reflection of the cosmic Abzu, a point of contact between the underground realm and the surface world. This pool, often described in texts as a miniature Abzu or as the dwelling of the Abzu in the upper world, served important ritual functions in the religious life of the community. The water it contained was understood as sacred water, charged with divine power and capable of purifying those who came into contact with it. The water of the Abzu was also understood as the substance from which life itself was originally created. In several Mesopotamian creation narratives, the creation of human beings is described as a process of molding or shaping that makes use of clay mixed with water from the Abzu, a cosmological reflection of the practical reality that clay, the basic building material and the medium for writing in ancient Mesopotamia, was formed by mixing earth with water. The Abzu also played an important role in the mythology of the underworld and of death and resurrection. In Mesopotamian thought, the underground realm was not merely the domain of living waters, it was also the realm of the dead, and the boundary between the waters of the Abzu and the darkness of the underworld was porous and permeable. Enki's mastery of the Abzu gave him a privileged relationship with both life and death, with the forces of creation and the forces of dissolution. In the great epic of Gilgamesh, one of the masterpieces of world literature that emerged from the Mesopotamian tradition, the connection between the Abzu and the secret of immortality is made explicit. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea in the depths that correspond to the Abzu, which has the power to restore youth and vitality. Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the sea and retrieves this plant, which he calls, "Let the old man become young again." The plant is subsequently stolen by a serpent, condemning Gilgamesh to mortality, but the episode confirms the deep association in Mesopotamian thought between the depths of the waters and the secret of eternal life. The cosmological significance of the Abzu persisted throughout the entire history of Mesopotamian civilization and left its mark on the religious traditions that succeeded and absorbed the Mesopotamian heritage. The sacred pool or fountain that is a feature of many religious traditions in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world may in part reflect the influence of the Mesopotamian concept of the Abzu and its association with divine wisdom and purifying power. In Islamic architecture, the courtyard pool or fountain that is a standard feature of mosque design serves a ritual function of purification before prayer that has structural parallels with the sacred pool of Enki's temples. The deeper symbolism of the Abzu extends beyond its practical associations with water and purification into the realm of philosophical metaphor. The idea of the deep, of the unfathomable depths of reality that lie beneath the surface of ordinary perception has been one of the most productive and most pervasive metaphors in the history of human thought. In the Mesopotamian tradition, this metaphor was made concrete and specific in the form of the Abzu, the actual underground ocean whose depths were the dwelling place of the wisest and most powerful of the gods. Enki's residence in the Abzu was thus a statement about the nature of wisdom itself. True wisdom is not found on the surface, but in the depths, not in the obvious and the visible, but in the hidden and the profound. The Abzu as a concept thus transcends its specific Mesopotamian context and speaks to a universal human intuition about the nature of knowledge and the sources of creative power, the image of the wise person as one who draws from deep wells, who has access to hidden sources of knowledge and understanding that are not available to those who remain on the surface, is an image that recurs in many different cultures and many different traditions. Enki, as the Lord of the Abzu, is the divine embodiment of this image, the mythological expression of the conviction that the deepest and most powerful wisdom comes from the depths, from the hidden places where the foundations of reality are to be found. Names and epithets. The study of divine names and epithets in ancient Mesopotamian religion is not a mere exercise in philology. It is a window into the theological mind of a civilization that expressed its deepest beliefs through the careful and deliberate use of language. In a culture that believed words had genuine power, that the name of a thing was intimately connected to its essential nature, and that the correct performance of language in ritual and prayer was a prerequisite for effective communication with the divine. The names and epithets of a god were not decorative flourishes, but substantive theological statements. The many names and epithets applied to Enki across more than 3 millennia of Mesopotamian religious literature thus constitute a rich and complex theological portrait of the deity. The name Enki itself is a Sumerian compound meaning Lord of the Earth, composed of the elements En, meaning Lord, and Ki, meaning Earth. This name requires careful interpretation because the Sumerian word Ki does not mean earth in the simple sense of soil or land. It refers to the fundamental cosmic principle of the earth, the lower realm of the cosmos as distinguished from the upper realm of heaven. In this sense, Enki as Lord of the Earth is not merely the god of the soil or of agriculture. He is the divine master of the entire lower cosmic realm. The Akkadian name Ea, by which Enki was known throughout the Babylonian and Assyrian periods, is of uncertain but intriguing etymology. The most widely accepted interpretation derives it from a Sumerian phrase meaning house of water, connecting it to the divine dwelling in the Abzu that was so central to Enki's mythology. An alternative interpretation derives it from an Akkadian root related to the concept of wisdom or knowledge, which would make the name itself a statement about the deity's primary attribute. Among the most important of Enki's many epithets is Nudimmud, a Sumerian name that appears frequently in the literary texts, and that is generally translated as the fashioner of everything or the creator. This epithet captures one of the most fundamental aspects of Enki's divine function, his role as the master craftsman, the divine artisan who shapes and fashions the forms of living things and of the material world. The same root appears in the Sumerian words for a craftsman or artisan, suggesting that Enki was understood as the divine prototype of the human craftsman. Another significant epithet is Namzu, meaning the one who knows or the knowledgeable one, which directly reflects Enki's identity as the god of wisdom. This epithet emphasizes the cognitive dimension of Enki's divine power, his possession of the knowledge and understanding that make effective action possible. In Mesopotamian thought, wisdom was not merely theoretical knowledge. It was practical understanding, the ability to see clearly what needed to be done in any situation and to find the most effective means of doing it. The epithet Enki of the Abzu, or simply Lord of the Abzu, is perhaps the most frequently encountered of all the names and titles applied to this deity. It places Enki in his primary cosmic domain and affirms his mastery over the underground waters that were the source of life and wisdom. This epithet also served to distinguish Enki from other water deities and to specify the particular type of water with which he was most intimately associated, not the destructive salt water of the sea, but the life-giving fresh water of the underground springs and rivers. Enki was also known as the Lord of the Mi, a title that reflected his role as the possessor and custodian of the divine laws and principles that govern civilization. The Mi were the fundamental ordinances of cosmic and social order, the divine rules by which the world was organized and by which human society functioned. Enki's possession of the Mi placed him at the center of the civilizational order, making him not merely a creator or a craftsman, but the ultimate source of the laws and principles that made organized human life possible. Among the epithets that reflect Enki's role in relation to humanity, particularly significant is the description of him as the father of humankind, or the creator of the black-headed people, the term by which the Sumerians referred to themselves. This paternal relationship between Enki and the human race was not merely metaphorical. It expressed a genuine theological claim about the nature of the divine-human relationship. Enki was understood not as a distant, indifferent creator who had fashioned humanity for his own purposes and then abandoned them, but as a loving father who remained actively concerned with the welfare of his children. Perhaps the most poetically evocative of all Enki's epithets is the description of him as the sweet waters, or the sweet water of the earth. This epithet identifies the deity directly with the physical substance of the fresh water that flows from springs and wells, collapsing the distinction between the god and his domain in a way that is characteristic of ancient polytheistic religion. Enki is not merely the lord of the sweet waters. In some sense, he is those waters, the divine presence immanent in the life-giving substance that sustains all living things. The accumulated weight of these names and epithets, when taken together, creates a portrait of extraordinary richness and complexity. Enki emerges as a deity who was simultaneously the cosmic architect of the universe's deep structures, the divine craftsman who fashioned living forms, the supreme possessor of wisdom and knowledge, the protector and creator of humanity, and the divine embodiment of the life-giving fresh waters that made civilization possible. No single name or epithet captures the whole of this figure. It is only in the full constellation of his titles, assembled over 3,000 years of theological reflection, that the true scope of Enki's significance in the Mesopotamian religious imagination becomes fully apparent. The Me, the divine laws of civilization. Of all the concepts associated with Enki's role in the ordering of the cosmos and the sustaining of human society, perhaps none is more philosophically ambitious or more distinctively Mesopotamian than the Me. This Sumerian word, which resists easy translation into any modern language, refers to a set of divine principles, decrees, and ordinances that were understood to underlie the entire structure of civilized life. The Me were not merely laws in the sense of rules or prohibitions. They were something closer to the fundamental categories of reality as it was organized and experienced by human beings living in an ordered society. They were, in the truest sense, the conditions of possibility for civilization itself. The range of things encompassed by the Me is extraordinary in its breadth. Ancient Sumerian texts list the Me as including such foundational institutions as kingship, priesthood, and the descent to the underworld, such practical arts as carpentry, metalworking, leatherworking, and weaving, such intellectual and spiritual practices as music, scribal knowledge, and the rites of religious purification, and such fundamental aspects of human social life as sexual intercourse, the care of children, and the resolution of conflict. What is striking about this list is not merely its comprehensiveness, but its refusal to distinguish sharply between the sacred and the secular, between the lofty and the mundane. For the Mesopotamian theological imagination, all of these things, from the institution of kingship to the craft of the shoemaker, were equally expressions of divine order, equally instantiations of the cosmic principles that Enki held in his keeping. Enki's possession of the Me placed him in a position of unique and extraordinary responsibility within the divine order. He was not merely their custodian or their guardian, he was, in a deep theological sense, their embodiment and their source. The wisdom that allowed Enki to perceive and understand the deep structures of reality was the same wisdom that expressed itself outwardly in the Me, the principles by which that reality was organized and sustained. To possess the Me was therefore not an arbitrary privilege conferred upon Enki from outside. It was a natural expression of his essential character as the Lord of Wisdom and the Master of the Deep. The most celebrated mythological account of the Me is found in the Sumerian text known as Anu and Enki, a narrative of remarkable dramatic and theological richness that has survived in several fragmentary versions from the ancient scribal schools. In this story, the great goddess Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Lady of the Morning and Evening Star, travels by boat from her own city of Uruk to the city of Eridu, the home of Enki and the dwelling place of the Abzu. Her journey is understood from the outset as purposeful. She has come to obtain the Me from Enki and to bring them back to her city, thereby elevating Uruk to the highest position among the cities of the earth. The encounter between Inanna and Enki is one of the great dramatic moments in Sumerian literature. Enki, knowing that Inanna is coming and perhaps foreseeing her purpose, receives her with generous hospitality, feasting her and plying her with the sacred beer that loosens inhibitions and opens the heart. In his state of divine inebriation, Enki begins to bestow the Me upon Inanna, presenting them to her one by one in what becomes an extended and almost comic recitation of the entire catalog of civilizational principles. Inanna, characteristically shrewd and quick-witted, accepts each gift with alacrity before Enki has the opportunity to reconsider. When Enki sobers and discovers that all the Me have been given away, he dispatches a succession of divine agents to intercept Inanna's boat and retrieve the sacred gifts before they can reach Uruk. What follows is a sequence of confrontations in which Enki's messengers attempt by various means to stop the boat, and Inanna, aided by her faithful steward Ninshubar, defeats each attempt in turn. The story ends with Inanna arriving triumphantly at Uruk, the me safely delivered to her city, and Enki, in a moment of dignified acceptance, acknowledging that what has been given cannot be taken back and formally blessing Inanna's city with the gifts that have been transferred to it. The theological significance of this narrative is multi-layered and complex. On one level, it is a story of rivalry between two great cities, Eridu and Uruk, and their respective patron deities, reflecting the actual political and cultural competition between these cities in the historical period of the early 3rd millennium BC. On a deeper level, it is a story about the nature and the distribution of civilization itself, about how the gifts of ordered human life come to be spread across the world from their original divine source. The me, held in Eridu by Enki, are not intended to remain there in perpetuity. They are meant to be distributed, to be carried out into the world, to be received and enacted by human communities everywhere. The relationship between Enki and Inanna in this narrative is particularly revealing. Despite Inanna's cunning in exploiting his momentary weakness, Enki bears her no lasting ill will. His final acceptance of the transfer of the me, his blessing of Uruk and its goddess, reflects the characteristically wise and generous dimension of his personality that appears again and again in the mythological literature. He is capable of being outmaneuvered, but he is not capable of the sustained resentment and vindictiveness that characterize other great gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon. His response to having been bested is to recognize what has happened, to accept it gracefully, and to affirm the good that will result from it. The concept of the me also illuminates the relationship between Enki and the human craftsmen and scholars who look to him as their divine patron. If the me encompassed not only the great institutions of political and religious life, but also the practical arts and technical skills that sustained everyday existence, then every craftsman who plied his trade, every scribe who set his stylus to clay, every musician who drew music from her instrument, was in some sense enacting the me, giving concrete expression to the divine principles that Enki held in his keeping. The relationship between the god and his human devotees was thus not merely one of patron and client, of powerful divine being and humble suppliant. It was a relationship of creative collaboration in which human skill and divine principle worked together to sustain the ordered world. The me thus represents one of the most distinctive and most thoughtful theological ideas in the entire history of ancient religion, in their insistence that civilization is not merely a human achievement or a fortunate accident of history, but a divine gift, a set of principles embedded in the very structure of reality by the wisest of the gods. The Mesopotamians expressed a profound conviction about the meaning and the value of the ordered human world, and in their insistence that the keeper of these principles was not a distant, unapproachable deity, but Enki, the compassionate and sometimes irreverent lord of the deep, they expressed an equally profound conviction that wisdom, creativity, and the capacity for civilized life were not gifts granted reluctantly to an undeserving species, but the natural expression of a divine love for the human world and all its works. The creation of humanity. Of all the mythological narratives associated with Enki, perhaps none is more philosophically significant or more revealing of his essential character than the stories of how human beings came to exist. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the creation of humanity was not a single simple act, but a complex process that unfolded over time, involving the cooperation and sometimes the conflict of multiple divine beings. Enki's role in this process was central and indispensable. It was his wisdom, his skill as a craftsman, and his compassionate concern for the welfare of his creations that made human life possible and endowed it with the qualities that distinguish it from mere animal existence. The question of why the gods created humanity is answered with striking directness in the Mesopotamian mythological tradition. Human beings were created to serve the gods, to perform the agricultural and construction labor that the gods themselves found burdensome. In the great Sumerian text known as the Atrahasis epic, which provides the most comprehensive account of human creation to survive from the ancient Near East, the gods have been laboring for countless ages to dig the rivers, build the canals, and cultivate the fields that supply the divine households with food. Exhausted and resentful, the lesser gods eventually go on strike, gathering outside the dwelling of Enlil and burning their tools in protest. It is in response to this divine labor crisis that Enki proposes the creation of humanity. The solution that Enki devises is characteristically inventive and morally complex. He proposes that the gods create a being who will take over the labor of the lesser divine beings, freeing the gods from toil. But the process by which this being is to be created is not mechanical. It requires the active participation of a divine mother, the great goddess Ninhursag or Nintu, who will carry and give birth to the new creatures. Enki provides the knowledge and the design. Ninhursag provides the womb, and the raw material is a mixture of clay and the blood of a slain god, whose divine spirit will animate the new creations and give them something of the divine nature. The use of divine blood in the creation of humanity is a detail of profound theological significance. It means that human beings are not merely clay animated by divine breath, as in some other ancient Near Eastern creation traditions. They are beings who carry within them a literal portion of the divine, whose very substance is mixed with something sacred and immortal. This understanding of human nature as inherently divine, despite the mortal clay body in which the divine element is housed, runs through the entire Mesopotamian tradition and gives Enki's creation a dignity and a complexity that transcends the practical purpose for which it was originally designed. The actual process of creation in the Atrahasis narrative is described with a vividness and a concreteness that brings the divine workshop to life. Ninhursag mixes the clay with the blood of the slain god and shapes the first human beings by hand, pinching off pieces of the mixture and forming them into the shapes of men and women. This image of the divine potter shaping humanity from clay is one that recurs across many different mythological traditions, but in the Mesopotamian version, the involvement of Enki as the designer and the blood of a god as the animating principle gives the image a particular richness and depth. The more elaborate Sumerian account of the creation of humanity, preserved in the text known as Enki and Ninma, presents the creation process in a very different light. In this narrative, the creation of human beings is treated not as a solemn cosmological event, but as something closer to a divine drinking party, a scene of creative play in which Enki and the great mother goddess Ninma compete with each other in feats of creative ingenuity, while the other gods watch and applaud. The two deities, somewhat inebriated on divine beer, begin to fashion human beings from clay, challenging each other to produce increasingly unusual and difficult creations. What is most remarkable about this competitive creation narrative is its treatment of human disability and difference. Ninma fashions a series of human beings with various physical limitations: people who cannot see, people who cannot walk, people whose bodily functions are disordered. For each of these impaired creatures, Enki devises a social role, a way of participating meaningfully in human society despite the limitation. The blind person becomes a musician, the man who cannot hold his urine becomes a diviner, the woman who cannot give birth becomes an attendant in the royal household. Enki's response to imperfection and limitation is not rejection but creative accommodation, a finding of the unique gift or function that each individual, however different from the norm, can contribute to the social whole. This aspect of the creation myth speaks to a remarkably sophisticated understanding of human diversity and social inclusion. In a world that was often brutal in its treatment of those who could not contribute to the agricultural and military economy that sustained ancient civilizations, the Enki mythology offered a different vision. One in which wisdom consisted precisely in recognizing the value in apparent uselessness, in finding the right role for every human being regardless of their limitations. That this vision was placed in the mouth of the wisest god in the Mesopotamian pantheon gave it a theological authority that transcended the practical exigencies of daily life. The creation myth tradition also includes accounts of Enki's role in teaching the newly created human beings the arts and skills that make civilized life possible. In the Sumerian literary tradition, the period immediately following the creation of humanity is described as a time of ignorance and helplessness, when human beings existed without knowledge of agriculture, without tools, without language, without the social institutions that make communal life possible. It was Enki, in his role as the Lord of Wisdom and the patron of all practical arts, who descended to the earth and began the long process of instruction that transformed these helpless creatures into the founders of civilization. The image of Enki as the divine teacher of humanity, descending from his dwelling in the Abzu to walk among human beings and instruct them in the arts of civilized life, has obvious parallels with other traditions of divine benefactors who bring civilization to humanity. Prometheus among the Greeks, who stole fire and taught the arts to human beings. The Oannes figure of Babylonian tradition, a being half human and half fish, who emerged from the sea to teach the arts of writing, architecture, and law. These parallels suggest that the figure of the divine teacher is one of the deep archetypes of human mythological imagination, a recurring symbol of the conviction that the knowledge and skills that make civilization possible did not arise spontaneously from human ingenuity alone, but were gifts from some higher source. The theological implications of Enki's role as creator and teacher of humanity are profound. If human beings were created by Enki and instructed by him in the arts of civilized life, then the relationship between the wisest of the gods and the human race is not merely one of creator and creation, but something closer to parent and child, or master craftsman and apprentice. Human beings are, in a real sense, Enki's project, his ongoing creation, the work to which he has committed his wisdom and his care. This understanding of the divine-human relationship as one of ongoing commitment and mutual responsibility, rather than the distant, indifferent sovereignty of a god who has set the world in motion and then left it to its own devices, is one of the most distinctive and most humane contributions of the Enki tradition to the history of religious thought. The creation of humanity in the Mesopotamian tradition is thus not a simple or unambiguous gift. Human beings were created for a purpose, to relieve the gods of labor, and the tensions inherent in this purpose run through the entire tradition. Yet Enki's involvement in the creation and instruction of humanity consistently transforms these tensions in the direction of compassion and care. Whatever the original purpose of humanity's creation, whatever the practical necessities that drove the gods to fashion human beings from clay and divine blood, Enki's relationship with his creations transcended those purposes and became something richer and more meaningful, a relationship of genuine care, expressed in the ongoing gift of wisdom and the continuous protection of human life against the forces that threaten to destroy it. Enki and the Great Flood. Of all the stories told about Enki in the vast corpus of Mesopotamian mythology, none is more dramatic or more theologically significant than the account of his role in saving humanity from the Great Flood. This story, which exists in several versions across the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian literary traditions, and which clearly stands behind the biblical account of Noah's flood, represents Enki at his most characteristically complex, at once obedient to the letter of a divine decree he cannot openly defy, and yet finding within that constraint a way to preserve the human race from destruction. It is a story about the tension between law and compassion, between divine authority and divine love, and the resolution it offers is one of the most thoughtful ethical statements in the literature of the ancient world. The fullest and most literary account of the flood story is found in the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text composed sometime around the 17th century BC that draws on much older Sumerian sources. In this narrative, the flood is not a sudden or arbitrary divine decision. It is the culmination of a long and escalating series of conflicts between the gods and the human beings they created. The problem, in a characteristically Mesopotamian formulation, is not human sin or wickedness, but human noise. The rapidly multiplying human population has become so loud that the god Enlil cannot sleep. and his repeated attempts to reduce the human population through plague, drought, and famine are frustrated by Enki, who secretly warns his human devotees of each impending catastrophe and teaches them how to survive it. The dynamic established in these preliminary episodes is central to understanding the meaning of the flood narrative as a whole. Enlil is not presented as a villain. He is a god with legitimate authority whose sleep is genuinely disturbed by human noise. Enki is not presented as a rebel. He is a god who operates within the constraints of divine law while finding every possible means of mitigating its harshest consequences. The tension between these two gods is the tension between two genuine goods, the authority of the divine order and the welfare of the human race, and Enki's genius consists in his ability to honor both without entirely sacrificing either. When Enlil finally convinces the divine council to sanction the ultimate solution, the flood that will destroy all of humanity, Enki faces his most difficult challenge. He has been bound by oath along with all the other gods not to reveal the divine decision to any human being. The flood decree is the decree of the entire council, and to violate it openly would be to set himself against the entire divine order. Yet to remain silent would be to allow the destruction of the human race that he created and loves. The solution that Enki finds to this dilemma is a masterpiece of creative reasoning, a demonstration of the kind of lateral thinking that consistently distinguishes him from his fellow gods. Rather than speaking directly to his human devotee, the pious man Atrahasis, Enki addresses his words not to the man, but to the reed wall of his house. He speaks as if to the wall itself, describing the impending catastrophe and the instructions for building a boat that will survive it. Atrahasis, who is listening on the other side of the wall, naturally hears every word. Enki has thus conveyed his warning without technically violating his oath. He has not revealed the divine decision to a human being, but to a wall. The legal ingenuity of this solution is breathtaking, and deliberately so. It is a demonstration that true wisdom consists not in rigid adherence to the letter of the law, but in finding the spirit behind the law and honoring it through creative interpretation. The instructions that Enki provides through the reed wall are detailed and practical. Atrahasis is told to build a boat of specific dimensions, sealed with bitumen against the waters, large enough to carry his family, his animals, and the seeds of all living things. The parallels with the biblical account of Noah's Ark are obvious and significant. The Mesopotamian flood story is clearly one of the primary sources from which the biblical narrative was drawn, and the figure of Enki stands behind the role of God in the Genesis account as the divine being who chooses to preserve a righteous human through the catastrophe that destroys the rest. The flood itself, when it comes, is described in the Atrahasis epic with vivid and terrifying imagery. The great gods themselves are frightened by the violence of the destruction they have unleashed. Even Enlil, who decreed the flood, is appalled by the reality of it. The goddess Nintu weeps at the destruction of the human beings she helped to create, and Enki watches in silence, having done what he could within the constraints of the divine order, waiting for the waters to recede and the world to begin again. The aftermath of the flood is as theologically rich as the event itself. When Enlil discovers that Atrahasis and his family have survived, he is furious, rightly suspecting that Enki is responsible for the survival of the human race. The confrontation between Enlil and Enki that follows is one of the great ethical debates in ancient literature. Enki defends himself not by denying what he has done, but by challenging the justice of the flood decree itself. Was it right, he asks, to destroy the innocent along with the guilty? Was it wise to eliminate entirely the human race that the gods themselves created? Enlil, confronted with these questions, has no fully satisfying answer, and the resolution of the conflict involves a series of compromises that establish the conditions of human existence going forward. The theological resolution of the flood narrative in the Mesopotamian tradition is significantly different from the biblical resolution. rather than establishing an unconditional covenant that humanity will never again be destroyed. The Mesopotamian tradition establishes a set of mechanisms for controlling human population and noise without recourse to total annihilation. Death is introduced as a permanent feature of human existence rather than a divine punishment. Infertility and infant mortality are established as natural limiting factors. These measures, while grim in their practicality, reflect the Mesopotamian theological conviction that the world operates according to principles of balance and regulation, and that the challenge of divine governance consists in maintaining that balance without resorting to the extreme measures that the flood represented. The Sumerian version of the flood story, preserved in the fragmentary text known as the Eridu Genesis, offers a somewhat different perspective on the same events. Here, the flood hero is called Ziusudra, a figure who is described as a pious king devoted to the service of the gods. His relationship with Enki is portrayed in terms of regular divine instruction and guidance, with Enki appearing to Ziusudra in dreams and visions to warn him of the impending catastrophe. This version of the story emphasizes the personal, devotional relationship between Enki and his human favorite, presenting the warning not as a technical legal maneuver, but as an expression of genuine divine love for a worthy human being. The figure of the flood survivor in both the Sumerian and Babylonian traditions is not merely a lucky accident. He is the result of Enki's deliberate and carefully reasoned intervention, the living proof that even within the most extreme expressions of divine power, wisdom finds a way to preserve what is most valuable. The flood story is thus ultimately a story about the triumph of compassion over power, of creative intelligence over brute force, of the god who finds a way where other gods can only destroy. In this sense, it is the quintessential Enki story, the narrative that best captures what makes this deity unique in the Mesopotamian pantheon and what gives his mythology its enduring moral force. The influence of the Mesopotamian flood tradition on subsequent religious and literary history has been incalculable. The biblical flood narrative, which shaped the entire subsequent history of Western religion, draws directly on the Mesopotamian sources and the figure of Enki as the compassionate divine being who saves a worthy human from catastrophe left its mark on the characterization of the god of Genesis. More broadly, the flood story, as preserved in the Mesopotamian tradition, introduced into the human literary imagination a set of questions about divine justice, human suffering, and the proper relationship between the gods and their creation that have continued to animate religious and philosophical thought across thousands of years and across the boundaries of many different cultural traditions. Enki as the trickster god. Among the many dimensions of Enki's complex divine personality, perhaps none has attracted more scholarly fascination or generated more interpretive debate than his role as the divine trickster. In a pantheon populated primarily by gods of power and authority, storm gods and warrior gods, and gods of royal legitimacy whose relationship to their worshippers was fundamentally one of overwhelming might, Enki stands apart as a deity whose characteristic mode of action is not force, but cunning, not command, but cleverness, not the straightforward exercise of power, but the oblique and often mischievous deployment of superior intelligence. To understand Enki as a trickster is to understand something important about the Mesopotamian conception of wisdom itself, and about the complex and sometimes ambivalent relationship between intelligence and authority. The trickster is one of the great archetypes of world mythology, a figure found in the religious traditions of cultures on every continent and in every period of human history. From the Norse Loki to the Native American coyote, from the West African Anansi to the Greek Hermes, the trickster appears wherever human beings have reflected deeply enough on the nature of intelligence to recognize that cleverness and power are different things, and that the weak or the constrained can sometimes achieve through guile what they could never accomplish through force. Enki belongs to this company of divine tricksters, but he brings to the archetype a distinctively Mesopotamian inflection. His tricks are not random mischief, but purposeful interventions. His cunning is always in the service of wisdom rather than mere self-interest, and his deceptions are almost invariably directed toward the preservation of human life and the maintenance of cosmic order. The most celebrated example of Enki's trickster nature is the story of his escape from the murderous anger of the primordial god Apsu in the Babylonian creation myth. When Apsu, disturbed by the noise of the younger gods, resolves to destroy them, Enki responds not with force, but with magic and cunning. He learns of Apsu's plan before it can be put into effect, recites a powerful incantation that puts Apsu into a deep sleep, and then kills him while he is thus immobilized. This act, while it might appear to be an act of violence, is in fact a demonstration of the superiority of knowledge over brute force. Enki prevails not because he is stronger than Apsu, but because he knows more, because his access to the deep structures of magical reality allows him to neutralize the threat posed by a being who would otherwise be beyond his power to overcome. The trickster dimension of Enki's character is particularly evident in his numerous encounters with the goddess Inanna. Their relationship in the mythological literature is one of mutual respect and mutual wariness, two exceptionally intelligent beings whose interactions are characterized by a kind of divine chess match in which each party attempts to outmaneuver the other. The story of the Me, in which Inanna successfully extracts the divine laws from Enki during a divine feast, is perhaps the most celebrated of these encounters, but it is far from the only one. In text after text, Enki and Inanna circle each other with a combination of admiration and suspicion, each recognizing in the other a formidable intelligence that must be treated with both respect and caution. The story known as Enki and the World Order provides another rich example of the trickster's characteristic mode of operation. In this narrative, Enki travels throughout the world, assigning divine functions and responsibilities to various gods and to the different regions of the earth. He decrees that certain gods shall preside over specific crafts or natural forces, that certain lands shall be characterized by specific agricultural products or cultural practices, and that the great cosmic systems of fertility and weather shall operate according to specific divine assignments. This organizational activity reflects Enki's role as the cosmic administrator, the divine manager who keeps the complex system of the world operating smoothly. But when Inanna protests that she has been overlooked and not assigned a sufficiently important divine function, Enki's response is a masterpiece of diplomatic evasion, listing her many powers and domains with such extravagant praise that the protest is effectively neutralized without any actual concession being made. The relationship between Enki's trickster nature and his role as the god of magic deserves particular attention. In the Mesopotamian understanding, magic was not an illegitimate or suspicious activity, but a legitimate and important aspect of the divine order, one of the fundamental tools through which the gods maintained the cosmos and protected human beings from malevolent forces. Enki, as the supreme master of magical knowledge, possessed the incantations and the ritual procedures that could address every form of spiritual danger, from demonic attack to divine curse, from physical illness to the contamination of sacred space. His mastery of these magical arts was understood not as a form of cheating, but as the highest expression of his wisdom, the practical application of his knowledge of the deep structures of reality. The ethical dimension of Enki's trickster nature is what most clearly distinguishes him from other divine tricksters in the world's mythological traditions, where Loki's tricks often serve no purpose beyond amusement or self-interest. Where Coyote's cunning frequently ends in chaos and suffering, Enki's deceptions are consistently purposeful and consistently directed toward the welfare of others. He deceives Apsu to protect the younger gods from destruction. He outwits the divine council's flood decree to preserve the human race. He outmaneuvers Enlil's punitive campaigns against humanity through a series of clever warnings and instructions. Even in his more playful interactions with Inanna and other divine figures, his cunning is always in the service of a larger wisdom, always oriented toward maintaining the balance and the order of the cosmos rather than disrupting it. This purposeful quality of Enki's trickery reflects the Mesopotamian theological conviction that wisdom is not merely intelligence, but intelligence guided by right purpose. A clever person who uses their cleverness for selfish ends is not wise. They are merely shrewd. True wisdom, in the Mesopotamian understanding, consists in the combination of superior intelligence and genuine concern for the welfare of others, in the ability to see clearly what needs to be done and to find the most effective means of doing it, even when circumstances constrain the available options. Enki's trickster nature is thus not a moral failing or a character defect, but an expression of his wisdom, the characteristic tool of the being who is simultaneously the most intelligent and the most compassionate of the gods. The playful dimension of Enki's trickster persona should not be overlooked. Many of the stories about Enki have a distinctly comic quality, a lightness and a wit that is unusual in the often solemn world of ancient religious literature. The story of his drunken gift-giving to Inanna has genuinely comedic elements. The story of his competitive creation of human beings with Ninmah is playful and absurdist in its accumulation of increasingly bizarre creative challenges. This willingness to portray the wisest of the gods in comic situations, to show him being outmaneuvered or finding himself in awkward predicaments from which he must extricate himself through cleverness, reflects a remarkable theological sophistication. A god who can only be portrayed in scenes of majesty and power is a more limited conception of divinity than one who can be shown in moments of vulnerability, improvisation, and even gentle self-mockery. The trickster archetype, as embodied by Enki, also carries important implications for the relationship between the divine and human worlds. If the wisest of the gods achieves his purposes through cleverness and oblique strategy rather than direct power, then human beings who find themselves in positions of constraint or weakness have a divine model for their own behavior. The figure of Enki suggests that intelligence, creativity, and the willingness to think beyond conventional solutions are not merely practical virtues, but sacred ones, qualities that reflect the divine nature more truly than the exercise of brute force. This theological message would have had particular resonance in a society where ordinary people were frequently subject to the power of kings, priests, and other authorities whose commands could not be openly defied. The lasting cultural influence of Enki's trickster nature extends beyond the boundaries of the Mesopotamian tradition into the broader history of religion and literature. The figure of the clever, compassionate divine being who achieves beneficent ends through guile and wisdom, rather than force, appears in many subsequent religious traditions and literary works, and it is at least plausible that some of these figures carry traces of the ancient Mesopotamian archetype. The Enki tradition thus contributed to the repertoire of divine images available to the human religious imagination, offering alongside the models of the warrior god and the sovereign god, a third model, the god of wisdom, whose power is expressed not in overwhelming might, but in the inexhaustible creativity of the intelligent, compassionate, and endlessly resourceful mind. Enki and the goddesses. The relationships between Enki and the great goddesses of the Mesopotamian pantheon constitute one of the richest and most complex threads in the entire fabric of his mythology. These relationships, which range from the deeply creative to the frankly problematic, illuminate both the specific character of Enki as a divine being and the broader theological landscape of ancient Mesopotamian religion, with its nuanced understanding of gender, power, and the creative tension between masculine and feminine principles. To trace Enki's interactions with the major goddesses of the tradition is to encounter some of the most psychologically sophisticated and theologically profound narratives in the ancient world. The most fundamental of Enki's relationships with the divine feminine is his connection with Ninhursag, the great Earth Mother goddess whose many names and titles reflect her importance as the divine embodiment of fertility, the earth, and the power of generation. The relationship between Enki and Ninhursag is one of creative partnership and recurring tension, a mythological exploration of the relationship between the masculine principle of wisdom and design and the feminine principle of generation and nurture. Together, these two great deities were responsible for the creation of living beings. Apart, each represented a necessary but incomplete aspect of the creative process. The most celebrated narrative of Enki's relationship with Ninhursag is the myth known as Enki and Ninhursag, set in the paradise land of Dilmun, a place described in terms that have obvious resonances with the biblical Garden of Eden. Dilmun is a land of extraordinary purity and beauty, a place where there is no sickness, no death, no old age, and where even the natural processes of predation and competition that characterize the world as it is normally experienced are suspended. In this pristine landscape, Enki and Ninhursag together preside over a world of primordial perfection. The difficulties begin when Enki's characteristic appetites assert themselves. He desires Ninhursag, and from their union is born a daughter. Then, in a pattern that repeats itself several times in the narrative, Enki desires his daughter, and from their union is born a granddaughter, whom he also desires. This sequence of incestuous unions, which modern readers inevitably find troubling, was understood in the mythological context as a symbolic account of the generation of plant life. Each daughter born from these successive unions corresponds to a specific plant, and the myth is explaining the origins of the botanical world in terms of divine genealogy. The repeated pattern of desire and generation represents the principle of life's irresistible drive to reproduce and diversify. The crisis comes when Enki eats the plants that Ninhursag has been tending, consuming the embodiments of his own divine offspring. Enraged at this act, Ninhursag pronounces a terrible curse upon Enki. She will not look upon him with the eye of life until he is dead. The effect of this curse is immediate and devastating. Enki begins to sicken in 8 specific parts of his body corresponding to the 8 plants he has consumed, and none of the other gods can help him. Only Ninhursag has the power to heal him, and she has withdrawn her life-giving gaze. The resolution of this crisis is brought about through the mediation of the fox, who convinces Ninhursag to return and heal Enki before he dies. She does so by creating 8 new goddesses, each associated with a specific part of Enki's body that is suffering, and each of whose names reflects a healing function or a creative principle. The healing of Enki through the creation of new deities is a theologically elegant resolution. The destructive cycle of desire and consumption is transformed into a creative act, and the suffering caused by Enki's transgression becomes the occasion for the generation of new divine beings who will play important roles in the cosmic order. The relationship between Enki and the great goddess Inanna is even more complex and even more central to the Mesopotamian theological tradition. Inanna, the queen of heaven and the goddess of love, beauty, sex, war, justice, and political power, is in many ways Enki's most formidable divine counterpart, a being of extraordinary power and ambition whose relationship with the god of wisdom is one of the defining dynamics of the entire mythological corpus. Their interactions generate some of the most dramatic and theologically rich narratives in Sumerian literature, and the pattern of these interactions, in which Inanna's desire for power and Enki's wisdom about the proper distribution of power come into productive and creative tension, illuminates some of the deepest concerns of Mesopotamian theology. The myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, one of the masterpieces of world literature, places Enki in a role that perfectly illustrates his characteristic combination of wisdom and compassion. When Inanna descends to the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, she is killed and her body hung on a peg. No other god can or will help her. Even the great gods Anu and Enlil decline to intervene. Only Enki responds, and his response is characteristically creative and indirect. Rather than confronting the queen of the dead directly, he creates 2 small beings from the dirt under his fingernails, beings so small and insignificant that they can slip through the gates of the underworld unnoticed. These beings carry with them the food and water of life, and by sprinkling these substances on Inanna's corpse, they restore her to life. The theological significance of this narrative is profound. Enki's solution to the problem of Inanna's death works precisely because it is unexpected and unconventional. No being of power or authority could have passed through the gates of the underworld and returned. The realm of death is defined precisely as the place from which there is no return. But Enki's tiny creations, beings of no power or importance whatsoever, can move where gods cannot, because the rules of the cosmic order were designed to constrain power, not insignificance. This insight that the very smallness and powerlessness of Enki's instruments is what makes them effective is a profound statement about the relationship between wisdom and power. True wisdom sometimes achieves its ends through the seemingly insignificant rather than the apparently powerful. The relationship between Enki and the goddess Nisaba, the divine patron of writing, grain, and scholarship, is less dramatic than his relationships with Ninhursag and Inanna, but no less theologically significant. Nisaba was the goddess most closely associated with the scribal arts that preserved the texts in which Enki's mythology was recorded, and the relationship between the god of wisdom and the goddess of writing was understood as a fundamental partnership. Enki provided the wisdom that was worth recording. Nisaba provided the technical skill and the institutional knowledge necessary to preserve it. Together, they represented the complete process of knowledge creation and transmission, from the initial insight to the permanent written record. The portrayal of Enki's relationships with the goddesses across the full sweep of the Mesopotamian mythological tradition reveals a divine personality of remarkable complexity and occasional contradiction. He is at various points the ardent lover, the reckless desirer, the creative partner, the compassionate rescuer, and the wise counselor. He can be outwitted by Inanna and healed by Ninhursag. He can also devise the plans that save Inanna from death and create the beings that Ninhursag's own power cannot produce. This variability, this refusal to be confined to a single role or a single emotional register, is one of the qualities that makes Enki such a compelling figure in the literature of the ancient world, and that gives his mythology its enduring vitality and relevance. The theological tradition that portrayed Enki in such varied and complex relationships with the major goddesses was making an important statement about the nature of divine wisdom. True wisdom, in the Mesopotamian understanding, is not a quality that exists in isolation, not a purely masculine or purely intellectual achievement. It emerges from relationship, from encounter with the other, from the productive tension between different principles and different modes of being. Enki's wisdom is not fully itself when it is contemplated in isolation in the depths of the Abzu. It becomes fully actualized only in his interactions with the divine feminine, in the stories of creation and crisis and rescue and competition that constitute the richest portion of his mythological biography. Enki's gifts to civilization. The role of Enki as the divine benefactor of human civilization is one of the most consistent and most theologically developed themes in the entire corpus of Mesopotamian religious literature. Across many centuries and many different literary traditions, the same fundamental claim is made repeatedly and in many different narrative contexts, that the arts, skills, institutions, and knowledge that make civilized human life possible were not discovered by human beings through their own unaided intelligence, but were given to them by Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, who taught the human race what they needed to know to build and sustain a world worthy of their divine origins. The scope of Enki's civilizational gifts, as enumerated in the various texts that describe them, is extraordinary in its comprehensiveness. He is credited with teaching human beings the art of agriculture, including the cultivation of grain, the management of irrigation, the use of the plow, and the organization of the agricultural calendar that tells farmers when to plant and when to harvest. He is credited with teaching the arts of animal husbandry, including the domestication of cattle, sheep, and goats, the management of herds, and the processing of animal products. He is credited with teaching the arts of building, from the basic techniques of brickmaking and mud brick construction to the sophisticated architectural knowledge needed to build temples and palaces. The craft traditions that Enki is said to have inaugurated or inspired include metalworking in all its forms, from the smelting of copper and bronze to the working of gold and silver into ornaments and ritual objects. He is credited with teaching the arts of weaving and textile production, of leatherworking, of pottery, of carpentry, and of the many specialized crafts that supported urban life. Each of these craft traditions had its own divine patron or patroness, but Enki stood behind all of them as the ultimate source of the technical knowledge on which they depended, the divine master craftsman whose wisdom informed all the particular skills of the human world. Among Enki's most celebrated gifts to civilization is the art of writing, which the Mesopotamian tradition regarded not merely as a practical convenience, but as one of the fundamental achievements of human culture, the tool that made possible the preservation and transmission of all other knowledge. The connection between Enki and writing is multifaceted. As the god of wisdom, he was naturally associated with the highest form of intellectual activity in Mesopotamian culture. As the possessor of the me, he was the ultimate source of the civilizational principles of which writing was both a part and a means of preservation. And as the patron of the scribal school, the Aduba, he was the divine guardian of the institution through which writing was taught, and the tradition of learning was maintained from generation to generation. The Sumerian scribal schools, which were the primary institutions of higher learning in ancient Mesopotamia, placed themselves under the patronage of Enki and Nisaba, and the curriculum they taught was understood as a gift from these divine patrons to human students. The texts used in scribal education included not only the practical exercises in cuneiform writing that trained students in the technical skills of the profession, but also the great literary texts that preserved the mythology of Enki and the other gods. This educational connection between Enki and the scribal tradition created a feedback loop of remarkable productivity. The students who copied and studied the myths of Enki were simultaneously honoring the divine patron of their craft and preserving for future generations the theological tradition that gave their craft its highest meaning. The gift of music is another of Enki's contributions to civilization that receives extended treatment in the mythological literature. The Sumerian text, known as the Hymn to the Air Temple, describes Enki's role in establishing the musical traditions of the temples, including the composition of hymns, the organization of the choir, and the playing of the various instruments that accompanied divine worship. Music in the Mesopotamian tradition was not a form of entertainment. It was a sacred act, a means of communication with the divine world, and the correct performance of music was as important to the maintenance of cosmic order as the correct performance of any other ritual. Enki's role in establishing the musical tradition thus placed him at the center of the ritual life of the community. The gift of law is perhaps Enki's most consequential civilizational contribution, and one that has received extensive scholarly attention in recent decades as the connections between Mesopotamian legal traditions and subsequent legal history have become better understood. The Mesopotamian legal tradition, which produced some of the world's earliest written law codes, was understood not as a human invention, but as a divine dispensation, a set of principles derived from the cosmic order and given to humanity through the mediation of wise kings and priests who stood in a special relationship with the divine world. Enki, as the possessor of the me and the lord of the divine laws, was the ultimate source of this legal tradition. The connection between Enki and healing deserves particular attention as one of the most practically significant of his civilizational gifts. In the Mesopotamian understanding, illness was not merely a physical phenomenon, but a spiritual one, typically caused by the malevolent activity of demons or by the withdrawal of divine protection as a consequence of sin or ritual impurity. The treatment of illness thus required both medical knowledge and magical skill, the ability to diagnose the physical symptoms and prescribe appropriate remedies, and the ability to perform the rituals and recite the incantations that would address the spiritual dimensions of the disease. Enki, as the Lord of Wisdom and the Master of Incantation, was the divine patron of both aspects of Mesopotamian medicine. The figure of the physician in ancient Mesopotamia was thus understood as a servant of Enki, a human being who had been granted access to a portion of the divine wisdom that Enki embodied, and who deployed that wisdom in the service of sick human beings. The healing arts, including both the pharmacological knowledge of medicinal plants and the magical knowledge of protective incantations, were understood as divine gifts, transmitted from Enki through the tradition of medical and magical learning to the practitioners who served the community. This understanding of medicine as a sacred vocation, as an act of divine service rather than merely a practical profession, gave Mesopotamian healers both a high social status and a deep sense of religious responsibility. The gift of civilization as a whole is perhaps the most important and most theologically significant of Enki's contributions to human life. The Mesopotamian tradition understood civilization not merely as a collection of useful techniques and social institutions, but as a way of being in the world, a mode of existence that honored the divine order and expressed the highest potential of the human beings whom Enki had created and taught. A civilized person was not merely one who possessed certain skills or lived in a city. A civilized person was one who had received and was living out the gifts of divine wisdom, who was enacting in their daily life the principles of the me that Enki had bestowed upon the world. This understanding of civilization as a divine gift rather than a purely human achievement had profound implications for the Mesopotamian self-understanding. It meant that the achievements of human culture, however impressive, were always understood in relation to their divine source, always seen as expressions of a wisdom that transcended any individual human being or any single historical moment. The greatness of Sumerian civilization, its achievements in writing, law, architecture, music, and all the arts of civilized life was not merely the product of human genius. It was the unfolding in history of the gifts that Enki had bestowed upon the human race at the beginning of time. To participate in that civilization, to learn its arts and honor its institutions, was thus an act of devotion, a living engagement with the divine wisdom that had made it all possible. The legacy of Enki's civilizational gifts extends far beyond the boundaries of ancient Mesopotamia. The writing system that Enki's scribal tradition developed became the model for many subsequent writing systems in the ancient Near East and beyond. The legal principles that Mesopotamian scholars derived from the divine order that Enki represented influenced the legal traditions of many subsequent cultures. The medical and magical knowledge that Enki's tradition preserved contributed to the development of medicine and natural philosophy throughout the ancient world. In all of these domains, the civilizational gifts attributed to Enki continued to bear fruit long after the specific theological tradition that celebrated him had faded from living practice. The legacy of Enki in later traditions. The influence of Enki upon the religious, philosophical, and literary traditions that followed in the wake of ancient Mesopotamian civilization is one of the most fascinating and most complex questions in the comparative history of religion. It is a question that is complicated by the indirect and often invisible nature of cultural influence, by the fact that ideas and images rarely travel from one tradition to another with explicit acknowledgement of their sources, and by the sheer temporal and geographical distance that separates the world of ancient Sumer from the traditions that may have drawn upon it. Nevertheless, the patterns of connection are sufficiently numerous and sufficiently specific to warrant careful examination, and the legacy of Enki in the broader history of human religious thought is far more extensive than is commonly recognized. The most direct and most extensively documented channel through which Enki's influence flowed into subsequent traditions was the transmission of Mesopotamian religious and literary culture to the peoples of the ancient Near East during the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. The Mesopotamian city-states of the 3rd millennium gave way to larger imperial formations, including the Akkadian Empire, the 3rd dynasty of Ur, the Old Babylonian period, and ultimately the great empires of Assyria and Babylonia, each of which spread Mesopotamian culture, including its religious traditions, over an ever wider geographical area. The cuneiform writing system was adopted by many different peoples, including the Hittites, the Hurrians, the Elamites, and others, and with it came exposure to the literary and religious traditions that it was used to record. The connection between Enki and the God of the Hebrew Bible has been one of the most productive and most contested topics in the comparative study of ancient Near Eastern religion. The parallels between specific Mesopotamian myths involving Enki and specific passages in the Hebrew scriptures are too numerous and too specific to be entirely coincidental. The flood narrative, in which a righteous man is warned by a compassionate deity to build a boat and preserve the diversity of life from a divine catastrophe, is the most obvious and most extensively discussed of these parallels. The creation of humanity from clay, animated by divine breath or spirit, has obvious resonances with the Mesopotamian creation traditions in which Enki and Ninhursag fashion human beings from clay mixed with divine substance. The figure of the serpent in the Garden of Eden narrative has prompted some scholars to explore possible connections with Enki's frequent association with serpents in the Mesopotamian tradition. Enki was regularly depicted in Mesopotamian art surrounded by entwining serpents, and the serpent was one of his most characteristic symbols, associated with both wisdom and the regenerative power of the life force. While the serpent in the Genesis narrative plays a very different role from the serpent in Mesopotamian iconography, the association of the serpent with wisdom and with access to forbidden knowledge may reflect a common cultural background in which the serpent was understood as a symbol of the chthonic wisdom associated with Enki and his underground domain. The influence of Enki's mythology on the subsequent development of Gnosticism, the diverse religious movement that flourished in the early centuries of the Common Era in the Eastern Mediterranean world, has been proposed by several scholars and deserves careful consideration. Gnostic traditions typically featured a figure called the demiurge, a creator god who fashioned the material world and the human body from inferior substance, and a higher divine being, often associated with wisdom and light, who sought to liberate human beings from the prison of material existence. The parallels with the Mesopotamian tradition, in which the creator god Enlil represents authoritarian power, while Enki represents wisdom and compassion for humanity, are suggestive, though the specific mechanisms of transmission remain difficult to trace. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary sage who was believed in the Hellenistic and late antique periods to have received divine wisdom from the gods and transmitted it to humanity in a corpus of sacred texts, has been compared by some scholars to Enki. Like Enki, Hermes Trismegistus was associated with wisdom, magic, writing, and the arts of civilization. Like Enki, he was understood as a mediator between the divine and human worlds, a being who possessed knowledge of the deep structures of reality and who shared that knowledge with worthy human beings. The Hermetic tradition that developed around this figure, with its emphasis on the divine origins of wisdom and the possibility of human participation in divine knowledge, has interesting structural parallels with the theological tradition associated with Enki. In the Islamic tradition, the figure of Al-Khidr, the mysterious green man who appears in the Quran as the guide of Moses, and who is associated in popular tradition with hidden knowledge, immortality, and the guidance of spiritual seekers, has been compared by some scholars to Enki. Both figures are associated with fresh water and with a wisdom that transcends ordinary human knowledge. Both serve as guides to worthy seekers who come to them in need of guidance beyond what conventional wisdom can provide. Whether there is a direct historical connection between Al-Khidr and Enki is difficult to establish, but the structural parallels between the two figures suggest at minimum that they inhabit a similar imaginative space in the religious traditions of the ancient and medieval Near East. The revival of interest in Enki and the Mesopotamian religious tradition in the modern period has taken many different forms. Academic scholarship, which began the serious study of cuneiform texts in the 19th century, has progressively reconstructed a more complete and more nuanced picture of the Mesopotamian religious world and of Enki's central place within it. The work of scholars such as Samuel Noah Kramer, Thorkild Jacobson, and many others has made the great texts of Sumerian and Babylonian literature available to a general readership, and the stories of Enki have gradually become known to audiences far beyond the confines of academic Assyriology. The influence of Enki's mythology on contemporary popular culture, while diffuse and often unacknowledged, is nonetheless real and worthy of note. The image of the wise, benevolent creator who stands between humanity and destructive divine power, who uses cleverness and compassion rather than force to protect the human race, has proven to be a remarkably durable and adaptable archetype. It appears in fantasy literature, in science fiction, in film and television, often without any explicit connection to the ancient Mesopotamian tradition, but drawing nonetheless on a deep cultural memory of what it means for wisdom to serve humanity rather than to exploit it. The New Age and neo-pagan religious movements of the 20th and 21st centuries have shown considerable interest in Enki, sometimes interpreting his mythology in ways that depart significantly from what the ancient texts actually say, but but that reflect, nonetheless, a genuine appreciation for the distinctive qualities that make him such a compelling divine figure. For practitioners of Reconstructionist Mesopotamian religion, and for those who seek in the ancient traditions resources for a contemporary spirituality that honors both wisdom and the natural world, Enki has emerged as one of the most accessible and most meaningful figures in the ancient Near Eastern pantheon. The lasting legacy of Enki is ultimately not to be found in any specific institutional tradition or any particular line of cultural transmission, but in the enduring power of the archetype he represents. The god of wisdom who loves humanity, the divine craftsman who shapes living forms with skill and care, the compassionate protector who stands between the human race and the forces that would destroy it, the trickster whose cleverness serves the cause of life. These are images that speak to something deep in the human religious imagination, something that transcends the specific cultural context in which they were first articulated, and that finds resonance in every age and every tradition that takes seriously the questions of wisdom, compassion, and the proper relationship between divine power and human welfare. The enduring relevance of Enki. At the conclusion of this extended study of one of the ancient world's most remarkable divine figures, it is appropriate to step back from the detail of myth and theology and to ask the larger question that has implicitly animated every page of this work. Why does Enki matter? Why should a modern reader, living in a world utterly unlike the ancient Mesopotamian cities in which his worship flourished, invest the effort and the attention required to understand a deity whose temples have been dust for 2,000 years? What does this ancient figure have to offer to the contemporary seeker after wisdom, meaning, and understanding of the human condition? The answer, as this study has attempted to demonstrate, is a great deal. Enki matters because the questions he embodies and the answers his mythology proposes are not merely historical curiosities, but living responses to perennial human concerns. The question of how wisdom should be wielded, and for whose benefit, is as urgently relevant today as it was in the scribal schools of ancient Sumer. The question of how to respond to authority that exercises its power unjustly, of how to find within the constraints of the given order the space to do what compassion requires, is a question that every generation must answer for itself. The question of what it means to create responsibly, to bring into being things that have needs and interests of their own, and to which the Creator therefore bears ongoing obligations, is a question that resonates with particular force in an age of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and other technologies that give human beings godlike creative powers. Enki's mythology offers to these questions answers that are distinguished by their refusal of easy resolutions and their insistence on the complexity and the difficulty of truly wise action. He does not simply defy unjust authority. He works within its constraints while finding every possible way to mitigate its worst effects. He does not simply abandon his responsibilities as a creator. He remains actively engaged with the welfare of his creations across vast stretches of time and through endless crises. He does not present himself as infallible or beyond error. He makes mistakes. He has weaknesses. He is sometimes outwitted and sometimes caught by his own appetites. But he keeps returning to the fundamental orientation that defines his character, the commitment to wisdom, to creativity, and to the protection and nurturing of life in all its forms. This combination of genuine fallibility and genuine commitment is one of the most psychologically realistic and spiritually compelling aspects of Enki's divine personality. He is not a god of impossible perfection, demanding of his worshippers a standard of behavior that no human being could ever achieve. He is a god who embodies the best that intelligence and compassion can accomplish within the constraints of a flawed and often unjust world. A god whose wisdom consists not in transcending the difficulties of existence, but in engaging with them creatively, persistently, and with an unshakable commitment to the welfare of living beings. The figure of Enki also offers important resources for thinking about the relationship between knowledge and power, one of the defining concerns of contemporary civilization. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the wisest of the gods is not the most powerful. wisdom and power are understood as different qualities that may or may not go together. Enki's position in the divine hierarchy, acknowledged as the wisest of the gods while formally subordinate to Anu and sometimes constrained by Enlil's authority, embodies the conviction that the highest form of excellence is not dominance, but wisdom, not the ability to compel obedience, but the ability to understand truly and to act rightly in the light of that understanding. This is a message of enduring relevance in a world where power and wisdom continue to be distributed very unevenly. The Abzu, Enki's dwelling place and his primary domain, speaks to a universal human intuition about the nature of knowledge and the sources of creative insight. The image of wisdom as something found in the depths rather than on the surface, as something requiring descent rather than ascent, as something that emerges from the hidden places rather than the visible heights, is an image that recurs in the mystical traditions of many different cultures and that resonates with the deepest experiences of creative and intellectual life. The great ideas, like the waters of the Abzu, seem to arise from somewhere deep, from regions of the mind or the spirit that are not readily accessible to ordinary consciousness, and the cultivation of the depth from which they arise is one of the perennial tasks of the intellectual and spiritual life. The divine laws of civilization that Enki held in his keeping and distributed to the world, speaks to the Mesopotamian conviction that the achievements of civilized life are not merely human inventions, but expressions of a deeper order, reflections in the material world of cosmic principles that transcend any particular time or place. This conviction that there are real principles of justice, beauty, wisdom, and skill that human beings discover rather than invent, that the highest achievements of human culture participate in something that exceeds them, is one that has animated the greatest philosophical and religious traditions of the world. In Enki's mythology, it finds one of its earliest and most concrete expressions, grounded not in abstract argument but in vivid narrative, embodied not in philosophical propositions, but in the figure of a divine being whose wisdom and care for humanity make the principles of civilized life live and breathe. The stories told about Enki across more than 3 millennia of Mesopotamian religious and literary tradition are ultimately stories about what it means to be wise, what it means to create responsibly, what it means to love and protect the fragile beings one has brought into existence in a world that is often indifferent or actively hostile to their welfare. These are stories that the human race needs to keep telling, in whatever forms the current age finds most compelling, because they address questions that do not become obsolete and concerns that do not fade with time. Enki himself, as a specific historical divine figure, belongs to a world that is gone, but the wisdom he embodies and the questions he raises remain as alive and as urgent as they have ever been. To understand Enki is ultimately to understand something important about the human aspiration toward wisdom, that it is not merely an intellectual achievement, but a moral one, not merely the accumulation of knowledge, but the cultivation of the capacity for right action that knowledge makes possible. Enki's wisdom is inseparable from his compassion. His cleverness is inseparable from his commitment to the welfare of the beings he has created and serves. In this inseparability of knowledge and love, of intelligence and care, of the capacity to understand and the commitment to use that understanding in the service of life, lies the deepest and most enduring message of one of the ancient world's greatest divine figures. It is a message worth hearing and worth hearing again in every age that takes seriously the question of what it means to be truly wise. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.